All right, as usual, we're going to go ahead and get started, and people will join us as they're able. Next week, I want to let you know that our presenters will be Reverend Dr. Jill Versteeg, and she's the president and CEO of Evergreen Commons, and Suzanne Scholes, who's the director of the Day Center there at Evergreen. And their topic will be Aging in Place with Flourish. So I like that, flourish. Today we have with us Reverend Dr. John Hubers, who along with his wife Lynn is a member of Third. And until fairly recently, though, until his retirement from the mission field, he was an RCA missionary ministering in partnership with the seminary in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Prior to that, he taught in the religion department at Northwestern College in Orange City, Iowa, where he administered a global education program and taught courses in the area of cross-cultural relationships and Christian mission. Going back further, John served as supervisor for the RCA mission program in the Middle East and South Asia and as senior pastor of international churches in Oman and Bahrain, as well as congregations in New York, Michigan, and Texas. And John just returned last week from speaking at a conference in Jordan, as in the country of Jordan, on understanding Christian Zionism and its effects on Christians in the Middle East. In fact, back in 2004, he prepared the report on Christian Zionism for the General Synod. So we're so happy that he's available and just back and is able to talk with us today.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, John.
Boy, I hear that introduction, it just makes me tired. Makes me happy to be retired as well. So I'm really pleased today to be able to introduce you to people we should know a lot more about. I'm talking about brothers and sisters in the faith who have kept the witness of Christ alive in a part of the world where Christianity began. A long string of witnesses going back to the time of Jesus himself. And that's my task today, to introduce you to our Middle Eastern Christian friends. But I'm going to spend a good deal of time talking particularly about Palestinian Christians who hosted this conference that I was just at in Jordan. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but I want us to hear the voices and to hear their stories this morning as well. So the first thing we need to recognize about Middle Eastern Christians is that it started here. I mean, we know that. We know our New Testament. We know that it started really in Jerusalem. The church was born at Pentecost and quickly spread. In the first 2 centuries, spread to North Africa, spread to parts of Spain, into Italy, into what is now Turkey and Syria and Iraq and that part of the world. So the orange that you see there is where Christianity became a central part of people's lives in the first 2 centuries. And what we notice about it is that it's Syria, Egypt, North Africa, Mesopotamia, or Iraq. These were Christian centers. So basically, the church started as a Middle Eastern phenomena and then began to spread like wildfire. Notice, you may not be able to read it, but the dark spots are what we just looked at up to 300 AD. The next lighter is the area that was Christianized for the next 300 years. So in 300 years, it spread throughout that whole area. Notice it's all of North Africa, the Middle East, spreading into Spain and up into Europe. And then the yellow part, which up in Europe, that was much later. And those are our ancestors. We came into this story quite late. Those of us who grew up in the Netherlands or maybe Germany, we are latecomers to the story of Christianity. We're looking at its beginnings. But then, this is up to 600, then in 700, actually in the 7th century, 632, something happened that has forever changed the face of Christianity in the Middle East. What happened is Islam. 632, I should say 622, Islam began with an obscure tribal people in what is today Arabia, Saudi Arabia, in the city of Mecca, quickly spread, and notice it spread in the very places where Christianity was the dominant faith. North Africa, into Spain, up into Afghanistan, Iran, everywhere except into what is today Turkey, because that was the Byzantine Empire, and they resisted, and so there was a battle line between the Byzantine Empire and the growing strength of Islam. So this area that had been totally Christian, suddenly, and this also happened very rapidly, within 200 years, came under the sway of Islam. And so obviously the plight of Christians changed tremendously. And then even more when we get into the Middle Ages, from 1300 on, we have the spread of the Ottoman Empire, which was the widest spread of Islam, because they also took over the Byzantine Empire. One of the great testimonies to what happened is what was St. Sophia Church. That was the church of the empire up to the 6th century. That was in Constantinople, which is today's Istanbul. You can see now it has minarets on it. It has not been a church, and it was one of the great wonders of the early centuries. It became the center of the Islamic Empire, the Ottoman Empire. And it's interesting, when Lynn and I visited Istanbul some years ago, we went into the mosque, and you can't see it because it's too far away, but there's two discs inside this mosque. On the left-hand side is Muhammad, on the right-hand says Allah, and then in between them is a picture of the Virgin Mary with baby Jesus. And it's kind of an interesting testimony, because Muslims also accept the fact that Jesus was born of the Virgin Mary. So they also honor Mary. But the dominant thing is Muhammad and Allah. A testimony to what really transpired in the Middle East, and now has come to define Christianity in the Middle East, which was, this is always a surprise to people, even though Islam took over the area already in the 7th century, Christianity, in terms of people who were Christian, remained the majority up until the 10th century. They just became part of the Islamic Empire, although they were relegated to second-class citizenship. And by the way, they were not converted by the sword. That's one of the misnomers of Islam. They just converted. Partly because if you wanted to become a full member of that society, you had to be Muslim. And even today, that conversion is happening. We were in Egypt in 1980 for 1 year. That year, 3,000 to 4,000 Christians every year were converting to Islam. And that's been the case for a long time. So that is now the contemporary situation for Christians. They are a minority. In some places, a very small minority. When I was teaching this particular session to my global Christianity class at Northwestern College, I had the students read a really good article written by a Lebanese theologian about what it means to be a Middle Eastern Christian. And this is very telling and very indicative of what it's like to be a Christian in the Middle East today. He said there are two ways of being a Christian in the Middle East today. The first is to avoid estrangement from Muslims at all costs, the majority. Let's not rile their feathers, as it were. A Christian position of openness to the larger Islamic context, motivated by the desire for acceptance and equality, and aiming at finding common grounds for coexistence and cooperation. That's one way of being Christian. Many of the Christians that I know, I would say, take that approach. However, there are those who say, no, we have to maintain our Christianity. We have to separate ourselves from society. We have to save Middle Eastern Christianity at all costs. A Christian position of affirming the distinctiveness to Christianity from the larger Islamic context, motivated by the desire to safeguard Christian identity and specificity. By the way, I had a second slide here, but because we started late, I took it out. Because I believe we could say the same thing about Christianity in America. And I believe that one of the great splits in the church today is over this. There are those who want to get along with our neighbors, to accommodate, to be in dialogue, and then there are those who, no, we are Christian. We will not make any compromises. So interesting that same sort of attitude of Christians in this secular society is very similar to Christians in the Muslim-dominant societies of the Middle East. Some basic facts about Christians today. All Middle Eastern countries, except the Arabian Gulf states, have a minority Christian population. Now, I have to make a caveat here. There are a lot of Christians in the Gulf. I was a pastor of churches in Bahrain and Oman, but they were all expatriates. Indians, Filipinos, Europeans, Americans, Africans. So there's a few converts, but very, very few. So that's the one exception. Second, most Middle Eastern Christians are Catholic or Orthodox, divided into two main families, Chalcedonian and non-Chalcedonian. And while we could take the next half hour talking about Chalcedon, I'm going to just do it in a blurb because it's not necessarily well known what Chalcedon is about. Here's what it was about. The Chalcedonian definition is something that came out of a meeting in Chalcedon. It's a Christian doctrine that states that Jesus Christ has two natures, divine and human. He is fully human and fully divine. If you've ever heard that, that's the Chalcedonian definition. But that was a fought-over definition. And there were those at this council that did not agree with that. They believed that meant Jesus was kind of schizophrenic. He's got these two natures. They said, no, Jesus is one. And the human and the divine are blended together, but they were kicked out. They became the heretics. So when I talk about Chalcedonian Christians and non-Chalcedonian Christians, these are Orthodox Christians in particular who have been separate since the 5th century. So there's two Orthodox families. You know about Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Bulgarian Orthodox. Those are Chalcedonian Orthodox. But then we have the Oriental Orthodox, mainly in the Middle East, who do not agree with that Chalcedonian formula. And then finally, there are small groups of Protestants, mostly related to Anglican, Lutheran, and Presbyterian mission efforts of the 19th century. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we take a look at Christians in each of these countries. So in October of 2005, I was asked by the then General Secretary, Wes Granberg Michelson, to put together a leadership tour of our partners in the Middle East. And we happen to be partners with the Middle East Council of Churches, which includes 90% of Christians in the Middle East. So that's a lot of people. And I put together this tour, and you'll see a name that you'll be familiar with there. Doug Fromm was our ecumenical director at the time. Betty Voskel, she was in charge of diaconal work. A member of Third. Wes Granberg Michelson, General Secretary. Dave Scott happened to be the president of General Synod that year. Lynn and I met him at Synod this summer, and he said, that was a life-changing event for me. It just blew him away. He was a pastor in California at the time. Bruce Menning, who was my boss in Global Mission. Chris Van Isle lives here in Grand Rapids. She was the editor of the Church Herald. And Johnny Alicia Baez just kind of tagged along. He was in charge of our Latin American work. But this was the group that we went from place to place and visited our partners, Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant partners in several countries. And I'm going to use this tour to talk a little bit about Christians in each of the countries we visited. Starting with Egypt, which has numerically the largest Christian church in the Middle East, often estimated at 5 to 10%. Notice the big gap there. Muslims say 5%. Christians say 10%. They never do a census. That way, Muslims can claim there aren't as many Christians, and Christians can say, no, there are many more Christians. In fact, I have Coptic friends who say, no, 15% Christian. 4 million. Egypt's a big country. largest numerically, and by far the largest group of Christians in Egypt are the Coptic Orthodox, who are non-Chalcedonian. They were the heretics, but have maintained a faithful witness stretching back, they believe, when St. Mark, yes, the Mark who wrote the book, made a trip and brought Christianity to Egypt. And of course, we have the story of the eunuch who was met by Philip and made his way back. They also say, well, that's another way Christianity came. The best historical reference says it probably came in the 2nd or 3rd century with monks that came from the north. Whatever the case, it's been around for a long time, and their worship, they use a liturgy in the Coptic language that dates back to the 4th century. So we're talking about one of the oldest churches in the world. There are Catholics in Egypt as well. Other Chalcedonian Orthodox are there, and Protestants, but notice the numbers, quite small, the Protestants. It was our privilege to visit with members of the Coptic Orthodox Church, and when Lynn and I were in Egypt in 1980, one of the great joys of that time, every Sunday afternoon after church, we would drive into the desert to a monastery, and monasticism began in Egypt, to a monastery that is the oldest continuously occupied monastery in the world, dating back to the 4th century. I taught English to the monks. We would spend the night. Really, really enjoyed it. And I got to know a little bit more about the Coptic Orthodox Church. That's one of the monks that was my student. When we made this trip, I took the group out to the monastery so they could meet the folks there. So we spent some time out at the monastery, but we also, the highlight of the trip for many was meeting the Coptic Pope. And yes, they use the word Pope. This is the head of the Coptic Church. At the time was Pope Shenouda. He died 2 years ago. There's a new pope now. We had an hour and a half meeting with him. We were told by other Copts that's the longest meeting any foreign group has ever had with him. It was amazing. He told us the entire history of the church while we sat with him, dating back to Mark. That was a long talk. About 45 minutes of our time was him telling the story of the church. You'll see in the top left-hand corner, Wes gave him a Bible. This was when the new Revised Standard Version just came out. And so Wes, as a gift from the Reformed Church, gave the Pope the Bible. And we sat there for about 5 minutes while he paged through it. And we were getting very nervous. Is there something wrong with this Bible? He was looking at all the passages that deal with the nature of Jesus Christ. He wanted to make sure we got the right translation. And I still remember when he closed and he said, "This is a good translation." So we got it right. And we got icons from him too as a gift, which was really nice. But anyway, that was quite a meeting. We also met with the Evangelical Church, the leadership of the Evangelical Church of Egypt, the Synod of the Nile, which came out of the work of the Presbyterian Church back in the 19th century, became autonomous in 1957, 250,000 members. Notice that that's much smaller than the Coptic Orthodox Church. There's always tension among Christians in the Middle East between the Orthodox and the Protestants, because the Protestants are almost all came out of the Orthodox Church. They accuse them of being sheep stealers, is actually the term they use. But we have had a lot of relations with this Presbyterian church over the years. We move then to Lebanon. Lebanon is marked by the fact that up until about 1967, 68, Lebanon had a majority Christian population. And in the Constitution in Lebanon that was framed in 1929, very interesting way of dealing with the diversity, the religious diversity. They put together a constitution that said whichever whichever religious body is represented, that percentage is what you get in the parliament. So really up until the 1960s and 70s, the power in Lebanon was Christian. And of those Christians, by far the largest group is the Maronite Catholic, very powerful politically as well as religiously in Lebanon. But now note 34%, which means that they lost a lot of power and representation, mainly because the Palestinian refugees came pouring over the border. They were almost all Sunni Muslims. And by the way, they got it broken down. So there's Sunni Muslims have representation, Shia Muslims have representation, Protestants have representation. So they break it into these different groups. But Maronites are the largest. Maronites are in full communion with the church in Rome. Greek Orthodox, Chalcedonian, Melkite Catholic, separate from the Maronites, use a different liturgy. Armenian Apostolic, Catholic, mainline Protestant, notice how small they are, very small. Again, the same mission effort of the Presbyterians in the 19th century were also responsible for this church in Lebanon. We had a good time in Lebanon. I love Lebanon because it was part of my job for 5 years making trips there. Beirut is a wonderful city. It's so sad to see what's happened to it now. And not just because of the Israeli bombing, but their economy has completely collapsed. Our Lebanese friends are just really, really hurting. Anyway, when we were there, things were better. The gentleman in the bottom left-hand corner is the head of the Armenian Orthodox Church. Wes Granberg Michelson had been on the World Council of Churches, and he knew all these people. So he was going to see old friends. It was kind of fun to be traveling with him. And this is the church that we saw him in the bottom right-hand corner. Top left-hand corner, members of the Protestant Council. And this is a political entity. It's Protestants of various backgrounds who are given a voice on the parliament. They're given representation in the parliament based on their 2.5% of the population. And then, the Maronites gave us a feast. So the top right-hand corner. We ate well on this trip, really well, my favorite cuisine. So we met with the Catholics, we met with the Orthodox, we met with the Protestants, just very affirming, and to them that was very important because they know how little Western Christians know that they even exist. So often Arab Christians are met with this when they introduce themselves. Oh, I'm a Palestinian Christian. Oh, when did you become a Christian? When did you convert? Because of course all Middle Easterners are Muslims, right? So when did you convert? And my friend Mitri Raheb, who I'm going to reference in a little while, Palestinian pastor, when he was at General Synod to speak, and I'll never forget it, we had a workshop. He was leading the workshop, and he started it this way. He said, yeah, I often get American Christians saying, when did you become Christian? And he said, well, my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother was Jesus' babysitter. Oh, such a good response. So we had a surprise visit to Syria. It was not on the agenda, but our host, was the General Secretary of the Middle East Council of Churches, was a Syrian Protestant pastor. And he arranged for us, and it happened like we didn't know if it was going to happen. We were in Beirut, and he says, tomorrow we're going to Damascus. And it was myself and Wes Granberg Michelson and Bruce Menning, who is the head of mission, and him. Oh, and also the president of General Synod. Just the five of us were picked up in a limousine in Beirut, driven through the military checkpoint without even showing our passports, to be taken to Syria because we were going to meet with the head of Syria. But by getting to Syria, we had a chance again to visit with the heads of churches. And here's what we learned. Well, we didn't learn it then, because this was before 2011. The sad thing in Syria is the country collapsing, particularly after the Arab Spring. Notice the Christian population is about 10%. of Syria. That's a pretty high percentage. Notice what it is now, 1.5 million, down to 300,000. Very, very small percentage. People left and are still leaving if they can get out. Here, the Greek Orthodox, Chalcedonians, is the largest group. The remainder are Greek Catholics, Armenian Apostolic Church, non-Chalcedonian, those are the Oriental Orthodox, Syrian Orthodox, also non-Chalcedonian, and Protestants. And we met with the leaders of all these churches. And again, had a feast. The gentleman in the bottom left in the red, he is the head of one of two Syrian Orthodox churches. Very interesting church because most of his flock is in India. Syrian church is in the southern part of India. They split in the 19th century between those who wanted the head of their church to be Indian and those who say, no, we have to stay tied to the Syrians. And so he is the head of that other Syrian Orthodox church. And those Indians who are Syrian Orthodox insist they aren't actually Indian, they're actually Syrian. Interesting group. He feasted us too. The Melkite leader in the top right-hand corner, I don't even remember who the guy was in the bottom right. And then me with the guys who served the feast to us. And I felt like a giant. You know, in the Middle East, I always felt like a giant. I don't feel that way here. Then we were picked up at the Intercon Hotel downtown Damascus, another limousine, and we were driven up, and it really was up, to a small mountain overlooking Damascus to the palace, and we had another long meeting with Bashar Assad. I don't share that with too many people because he turned out not to be such a good guy. You know that he just fled Syria. But he was very amiable. Interesting story. No, don't want to tell the story. I'll keep the story. Anyway, we had that time with him. It was an amazing thing. I grew up in Orange City, Iowa, by the way. I kept pinching myself saying, am I really talking to the president of Syria? People from Iowa don't do things like that. And now we come to the part that I want to spend the rest of our time talking about. Partially because I just came from that conference in Jordan, to talk about our Palestinian Christian brothers and sisters. Notice in Israel, and you know there's Israel, there's the West Bank, and there's Gaza, the three different entities. Israel, about 1.9% Christian. That's down. All these numbers are down because Palestinians have gotten out as much as possible. Approximately 185,000 people in Israel proper. Largest group, Greek Catholics and Greek Orthodox Chalcedonians. Palestinian territories, 28,000 Christians, 1%. And one of the bishops that I was with last week, now a retired bishop of the Lutheran Church, very sadly said it was just 2% in 2012. Now we're down to 1%. Here, more than one-half Greek Orthodox, Latin Rite Catholics, and Melkite, which are different, what called the Eastern Rite, and then Protestants, each claiming 2,500 people. This conference I was at was sponsored by the Palestinian Lutherans, which is the biggest church in the West Bank. And then the Gaza Strip, down to 500. That was several thousand not too long ago. Those numbers are diminishing, as you can imagine. So I want to introduce you. I'm going to play part of a 2-hour documentary, and the name of this documentary is The Stones Cry Out. It is on YouTube, and I'm going to encourage you to watch the whole thing. I'm just going to show the first part of it, because you cannot understand Palestinian Christians without this story that I'm going to share with you.
Across the world.
Okay, let's start here. We're going to watch about 15, 20 minutes of this.
beginning, Christianity took root in Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq, and gradually spread across the world. Christians have lived continuously throughout the Middle East since the day of Pentecost, more than 2,000 years ago. They are the descendants of those early followers of Christ, their roots firmly based in the culture and traditions of the land. Yet few are even aware of their existence. The story of the Palestinian Christians is often drowned in the turmoil of events and overshadowed and neglected. An integral part of the fabric of Palestinian society, they have shared in the events of recent decades in the history of the Palestinian people. There are many dates of great significance, the most momentous of all, Saturday, November 29th, 1947. On that day, the nations of the world sat down at the United Nations to vote on Resolution 181 to partition Palestine into an Arab state and a Jewish state. The Zionist movement and the Jewish Agency mounted one of the most remarkable lobbying campaigns in history. They lobbied America and President Truman, and Truman lobbied the world. It was afternoon in New York when the voting began. The vote lasted only 3 minutes.
Soviet Union, yeah. United Kingdom, abstain. United States, yeah.
The resolution of the subcommittee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstained.
By the time the session was over, it was past midnight in Palestine. The Palestinians lost their homeland in their sleep. According to Resolution 181, Palestinians had to give up more than half of their land for the creation of the Jewish state.
They did that to us because they were convinced that a land without a people belongs to a people without a land. This is what Theodor Herzl has written in his famous booklet, Neu Altland, the New Old Land. And then they found so many people, they wanted to get rid of them. It's very shocking to compare what they have endured to what they made others endure. Yeah?
Archbishop Elias Shakur in his Christian village of Kfir Biram suffered the same fate as hundreds of other Palestinian communities. The people of Kfir Biram, a village in the northern Galilee, watched warily as wave after wave of refugees fled towards the Lebanese border, just a few kilometers away. The farmers of Biram had a tough decision to make: join the refugees before Israeli troops came to them, or stay in their homes and take their chances. This small community of Palestinians decided to stay.
We were very simple peasants who believed that violence begets violence. Everybody in the village was like a family member. We were all brothers and sisters for each other.
On October 29, 1948, the Israeli army captured the village. The capture of Kfir Biram was part of a larger military campaign called Operation Broom, intended to sweep Palestinians out of the Galilee.
الظهر تقريبا كانت الجيش مطوق البلد وقال كله بيجي على الكنيسة. أنا رحت حافي وأوعية خليتهم حد اللجأ حد الدستر مي مشان أتحمم.
اجا حاكم عسكري وانا بالدار نادى علي نزلت لعنده، اللي بدك تجمع لي تقول للمختير والخوارني يجوا لهم. لما اجوا قال لهم انه لازم تطلعوا من البلد، معكم 48 ساعه، شو بتقدروا تقيموا بتقيموا اغراضكم، واللي بلاقيه بالبلد بقتله.
I never forget the day of the expulsion because I walked 4 to 5 kilometers under raining when I was 10 years old. I have some small goats, babies, and they used to walk with me, but some of them were unable to continue. I am sorry for that I left two. Most of them I saved them and I saved myself.
I was around 9 years. I remember the day when we received the orders from the army to leave. This order was issued 10 days after the army arrived to the village, and they lived in our homes while we stayed on the roofs of the houses.
We left everything in the village, everything in our houses. We took only our keys with us, you know.
Just for time's sake, I'm going to encourage you to watch the rest of the film when you have time. It's hard to watch, but it describes the reality of Palestinian Christians, one of whom is a member of our congregation, Habib. His father is a pastor in near Bethlehem. And if you want to pursue it, talk to Habib, what his reality was like, because this is the reality of Palestinian Christians. 443 villages, not just Christian, were razed to the grounds by the Israelis after they became a state to make sure that the Palestinians would never come back. Literally razed to the ground. Sometimes they dug up cemeteries. They changed the name. And to this day, the Palestinians, some of whom still have keys, I met a Palestinian family who have keys to the house that they were driven out of. That's the story. And it wasn't just Muslims, it was Christians. They were driven out of their homes. Now, I'm looking at the clock because I want to now jump ahead, because this reality has been the reality and continues to be the reality, and we have a new wrinkle in that reality. The end result of all this, 48, state of Israel, then 67, Six-Day War. Israel took over and occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and has been occupied ever since. So the Palestinians have never had a state of their own. They're living under a heavy-handed Israeli occupation. And now, particularly Israel has been emboldened by their absolute destruction of Gaza, and knowing that they are the power to be reckoned with, they're now starting to say it all belongs to us. And there's evidence that the Israelis may be trying to drive the Gazans out and the people of the West Bank out. That's what our conference was about. Because there is a theology, a way of reading the Bible, based on a peculiar way of reading the Bible, that says that the creation of the state of Israel in 1948 was the fulfillment of biblical prophecy, and Israel has to have that whole area to themselves. And we just now, under this administration, have a UN ambassador and the Israeli ambassador to Israel who come out of that ideology. So, last week, there I am by the Jordan River, near the place where Jesus believed that Jesus was baptized. There's a number of churches there, and our conference center, our conference was held there as well. 53 participants, speakers, scholars, church leaders from 17 different nations. It was an amazing gathering. I don't know a gathering like this ever before. Put on by Palestinian Christians, but sponsored by Prince Ghazi bin Mohammed, who is a prince in the Jordanian royal family, who is very engaged worldwide in interfaith relations. And he was a part of our conference, and he footed the bill, which means that we got kind of VIP status. When I got the invitation, I said to Maitre, who contacted me, when he said, we'd like to invite you to speak, I said, Maitre, I'm retired now. I don't have a budget anymore. And he said, no, it's all paid for. So it was an amazing conference. And it was about Christian Zionism. Now, not a lot of people know about Christian Zionism. I do, because it's been a part of my area and I've been studying for many years. In 2004, I was asked by the Reformed Church to write a study paper on this. It still remains kind of the guide for the Reformed Church. If you can find it, it's buried on our webpage, in which I finally threw myself into really serious study of this. And here's how this is a quote from the paper that I wrote. Who are Christian Zionists? Well, Christian Zionists, like hardcore Zionist Jews, insist that the boundaries of the Jewish state should conform to a biblical map, which includes not only the present state of Israel, but the whole of the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip as well, territories they call Judea and Samaria. As moral majority co-founder and director of the Christian Zionist Religious Roundtable, the Reverend Ed McAteer said on 60 Minutes, every grain of sand between the Dead Sea and the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea belongs to the Jews. One of our speakers is the pastor of the Christmas Lutheran Church, downtown Bethlehem. I had dinner with him one night, an amazing guy. And he is tired of kind of dancing around the issues, and he is speaking out forcefully about, this is wrong. And Christians, stop supporting this theology that is harming us and destroying us. And just 3 days ago, he was on Instagram, and he posted this.
Speak for UN Ambassador Ellis Stefanik affirmed that Israel has, and I quote, biblical rights to the entire West Bank.
This is our UN ambassador.
Confirmation hearing. Let us take a listen.
But I did ask you whether you subscribe to the views of Finance Minister Smotrich.
I'm sorry, Finance.
Smotrich, this is the Israeli Finance Minister Smotrich, and the former National Security Minister Ben-Gvir, who believe that Israel has a biblical right to the entire West Bank. And in that conversation, you told me that, yes, you shared that view. Is that your view today?
Yes.
So let us ask ourselves, what does this really mean? What is biblical rights? See, in her worldview, biblical rights trump international law and human rights. It does not matter what the international law says. It does not matter who lived in this land for generations and hundreds of years, maybe more, because to her the land belongs to the Jews because God gave it to them, according to her understanding of the Bible. And if Israel has to ethnically cleanse Palestinians from the West Bank or subjugate them to apartheid, so be it, because Israel has biblical rights, according to Stefanik. And according to this worldview, any Jew who lives in Brooklyn, Manhattan, or Miami can relocate to the West Bank, displace Palestinians from their land, and live in their homes maybe. Why? Well, because they have biblical rights. Mind you, this is the US nominee for UN ambassador. It is amazing to me how Stefanik feels very comfortable imposing her religious beliefs on millions of Palestinians, let alone Middle Eastern Christians and Palestinian Christians, with total disregard to our beliefs, rights, or reality. This is coming from the same people who lectured us for years on the separation of state and religion. But of course, they are entitled to impose their religious beliefs that actually not many Christians or most Christians share, and they impose them on all of us here in Palestine, displacing us and uprooting us from our land. In every other context around the world, there is the rule of law and international treaties. But in Palestine, there is what American Christians and evangelical believers as the only ultimate truth to them. So they read the Bible in a literal horizontal way with total disregard to theology, history, and they equate Israel of today with the Israel of the Bible and imposing all of this on all of us, that we must accept their interpretation and, of course, the impact it has on our daily lives. I wonder if Stefanik has actually read the Bible, or even the Hebrew prophets. I wish she used the biblical principles of justice and righteousness and apply them on what's happening in Palestine today. Let me actually share with her what the Bible says, which I feel is more relevant. There is something we call the Micah mandate. Let me read it. What does the Lord require of you? To act justly and love mercy and walk humbly with your God.
Whew.
Recently, Trump's pick for UN Ambassador Ellis Stefanik
It's just repeating
affirmed that
itself.
Israel
Okay, let
has,
me go
and I
back
quote,
to the
biblical rights
PowerPoint.
to the entire West Bank during a Senate confirmation hearing.
Okay.
Let us take a listen.
Let me close that down. So, yeah. By the way, if you type his name in on YouTube, you'll see an amazing sermon that he preached at his church on Christmas Eve, and it went viral. And the other thing that went viral is he put the manger scene in his church last Christmas, and it was there again, was baby Jesus with rubble around him and a kafaya on him, saying that there's where Jesus is, he's with us. It's really hard to hear this, but that's the reality. And now, not only do we have a UN ambassador, we have a hardcore Christian Zionist named Mike Huckabee, who has been appointed to be our ambassador to Israel. And this is what he says: areas of Judea and Samaria are the indigenous lands of Israel from time immemorial. Never mind, there are 2 million Palestinians living there. They don't own their own land. I wish upon you the courage, speaking to Israelis, to be bold and to do that which is necessary to secure your homeland. Kick those people out, grab their homes. This is not land that you occupy, but land that you own and have a right to live there. This is a man who's going to be helping set policy for the United States. I'm sorry, but it's disturbing. So here's our choice. Do we support our brothers and sisters in their struggles? Do we ignore them, which is usually what we do? Or do we just do them harm by jumping on the bandwagon for those who are set to drive them even further away from their homeland? And I'm going to end with a commercial. This is the Reverend Dr. Mitri Raheb. He was the sponsor of this event. He has a university, a wonderful university he created in Bethlehem, and training young Palestinians in IT and art, and just amazing man. He was the former pastor of that church in Bethlehem, and I'm in conversation with Mitri to come here in November, being invited by a group I belong to called Kairos West Michigan, which is dedicated to help educate folks about the reality of life for our Christian friends in Palestine. So Mitri is we just have to find a date now, but I will keep you informed, because hopefully we'll have a gathering that will invite churches in the area to come when he speaks. He's a wonderful guy. He's the one who told that story about his great-great-great-great-great-grandmother. Well, let's have 5 minutes of questions.
Is he with the Bethlehem Bible College?
No, he's not at the Bethlehem Bible College. That's more Baptist background. We actually had the principal of that Bible college addressed our group in Jordan as well. But they're all, it's such a small group of Christians. They all work together. Denominational differences don't mean much when your bigger issue is hanging over your head. Yes, Russ.
You used the term openness to the larger Islamic context. That's an expectation of the people of Israel?
No, in this case, I was really speaking more about the Christians in the Middle East.
Middle East.
The only ones who are really dealing personally with the Israeli issue are the Palestinians. Now, there's a lot of sympathy among Arabs because of what that has meant, but existentially, the only ones who are really dealing with that are the Palestinian Christians. What that means is in Egypt, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, Christians have to find a way to get along with their neighbors. And let's build on those things that bring us together. Dialogue is a very important part of the life of Christians in the Middle East. And then there are those who know we have to stand firm and kind of stay away from dialogue, fearing that it's going to water you down and then you're going to lose your distinct Christian identity.
Thanks, John. Really interesting. So, looking at the quotes from Stefanik and Huckabee, it makes me think that there's also within the current group that's in power in Washington a concern about persecution of Christians. So are you seeing anything kind of clashing, like, hey, you know, we are supporting Israel, but they're persecuting Christians? Is there any of that kind of conversation going on?
You know, that's always been the great contradiction of those who are wanting to support Christians who are being persecuted in the Muslim world, but not in the Jewish world, because the Israelis are treating them so well. And besides, they're our friends. We don't want to criticize our friends. It's a little bit like in the days when Latin America was the whole Contra thing in Nicaragua. Well, we don't want to speak out of it. They're our friends. By the way, they're killing nuns, but they're our friends. Let's not talk about that. And that's a very similar thing here. And again, someone like Munter will point out the hypocrisy of that very quickly. He's an interesting guy. I'm glad I had a chance to talk to him. He went to Westminster Presbyterian Seminary in Philadelphia. He's a very conservative Christian, theologically, more conservative than Mitri. But he's conservative with also believing that the Bible teaches justice and compassion. And why do we make exceptions in the case of the Palestinians? Yeah, good question, Matt. Thanks. I think we have 1 minute. Chris?
This will be tough to answer in a minute, but it seems like the Christians are definitely squeezed in terms of what their future might look like.
Yes.
So how do they envision the best outcome as they move forward? Would they feel more comfortable being in a Muslim Palestinian-run state or on the Israeli side? I mean, which one's more comfortable for them moving forward, or is there an alternative that they're looking at?
Well, Muslims are their neighbors. They're under the same pressure. They would unequivocally answer that question by saying, we want a state of our own. And it's a matter of having the freedom to be who we are. For the same reason the Israelis wanted a state of Israel to deal with the persecution they faced at the hands of Christians for 2,000 years.
Okay, so did they feel more comfortable, the ones, the few thousand that lived in Gaza, for instance, they felt more comfortable in that setting under Hamas than they would under the Israelis?
That's a really difficult question, because Hamas was not necessarily great for the Christians or other Muslims. The radicalization of Palestinians because of the situation means that Christians get squeezed from both sides. But the idea of having a place of our own, then we can deal with the differences between us. But to be under an occupation, if you ever look at a map of the West Bank, I'm going to stop in 30 seconds. What you'll see on the West Bank are these settlements, and the Israelis have built a whole infrastructure supporting the settlements. There are highways, really nice highways, that only the people who have in these illegal settlements can drive on. Palestinians aren't allowed to go there. If my cousin lives 20 miles from me, I can't even see him, because I'm not allowed to go on the roads. That's their reality. That's been the reality. Gaza, different situation. Gaza's always been a different situation. The problem in Gaza is that the Israelis, yes, they granted them, quote, independence, and then controlled their all passages in and out. So they've been called the world's largest prison camp, open-air prison camp, and that was a good description of the reality. So what Christians really hope for is peace, but peace with justice, their own state, or if it's not their own state, then a true democracy, where they have as much voice in whatever state emerges as the Israelis do. The Israelis don't want that. They want a Jewish state. We better stop here. This is a long discussion, by the way. So thank you.
Thank you very much,
Yep.
John. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Lord.